Good morning. The special meeting of the Southern Shores Town Council for November the 7th, 2018 is now in session. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. In a moment, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of silence. I would ask that we, in our thought process, remind ourselves that we need to be patient with each other and show respect for each other's opinions and time. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got some notes I want to go over with you before I move ahead with public comment. I would remind everyone that this special meeting is not a public forum or a public hearing. The normal rules of public comment will apply. I'm sure you will hear. We will hear from many of you, and that's great. That's beneficial. Contrary to what you may have been led to believe by the SCSCA email of October the 15th, the town does not have the legal authority to override the issuance of any state permit, nor do we have the authority to refuse issuance of a building or zoning permit when and if the applicant has complied with all existing code conditions in their application. In other words, things we just cannot do. Following the public comment period, I will ask our town attorney to address our legal options, if you will, for consideration, followed by council deliberation and/or motions. At some point in this process, I will discuss an approach which I believe may be a viable one for us to consider. At this time, I'll open public comment.
Mr. Mayor, I believe you're going to need to read the purpose of the meeting, the special meeting.
Thank you, Peter. I thought people might have that in their agenda, but I can do that. My apologies for skipping this, guys, but I'll make you listen to it anyway. The specific purpose of the special meeting is for the town council to consider all available options, if there are any, to further limit occupancy of single-family dwellings in Southern Shores, and to provide opportunity for any council member to seek council approval to initiate the process of adopting a specific option, if available, as available, to further limit the occupancy of single-family dwellings, and finally to allow a period of public comment for the purpose of the special meeting, subject to town rules for public comment. Thank you. At this time, I'll open public comment. I do have a list here. Lots of sign-ups. Thank you. Lee Whitley. Morning, Lee.
Yes, my name is Lee Whitley. I'm not here in any capacity as being on the Historic Landmark Commission. I'm here as a longtime resident of Southern Shores, and I just worked for Kitty Hawk Land Company for many, many years, who's the original developer of Southern Shores. And I went back and I pulled off the land use plan that was written in the early 80s and published in 86 by Mayor Kern Pitts and his town council. I just want to read that to you real quickly. Land use plan 1986, a future growth. Southern Shores shall carefully plan and manage all future growth to minimize its negative effects. Southern Shores shall continue to develop as a low-density, single-family residential community. The town's policies and ordinances shall reinforce this pattern of development. Future growth and development should be managed commensurate with the capacity of the town's services and facilities to accommodate this growth. Should services and facilities need to be expanded, the cost of these expansions shall be borne in large part by the new development. Another goal, low-density, single-family residential development shall be the primary use of the land permitted and encouraged in the town. Now, I don't know what low-density means, what it meant then, but I doubt that 12 bedrooms and 17 parking spaces would be in that equation. I don't know what can be done, but maybe the thing is to address ground coverage and the parking that's going to create, or the impact that parking for 17-plus cars is going to create on the town, especially at the Chickahawk Light, and then again at the curb where the other house is. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Aaron Gardner. Good morning.
My family has owned a house here since 1952 at the corner of Skyline and Ocean, 39 Ocean Boulevard. My father passed away last year, so I've inherited this house. My grandfather bought it 2 to 3 months after it was built. To see this 12-bedroom, 12-bath monstrosity come to this area is not in keeping with the uniqueness of this town. I pray that y'all will find a way to stop them. This is just not what Southern Shores is. Thank you.
Thank you. Gwendolyn? Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Gwendolyn Smuts. My family owns the cottage at 133 Ocean Boulevard. We've owned it since 1961. We've made friends, longtime friends, of all the cottage owners in the area, families that we've known for 5 generations. Family is critical to what makes Southern Shores, Southern Shores. I thank you all for organizing this meeting and everyone for coming. I don't know what the answer is to keep Southern Shores family-oriented. It might be in limiting the structures or in limiting their use. But I'm grateful that we're all going to be working together to keep Southern Shores as a safe and pleasant place for families.
Thank you, ma'am. Sally Gudis. Morning, Sally.
Good morning. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to work together, as Gwen has said, to try to maintain the special character of Southern Shores. I'm Sally Gudis, and together with my husband Steve, we own 156 Wax Myrtle Trail, which I'm really proud to say is one of the, I guess it was the 3rd historic home designated with the new program of the Southern Shores Historic Landmark Commission. But today I'm not here about preserving flat tops. I am here because I don't think that's what this issue is. This issue is not about preserving the old. I certainly am in favor of that. But I'm more concerned about what goes in the place of a flat top when it gets torn down. And I do believe that a very narrow view of what this council has responsibility for will not serve our community well. I think that is what has brought us to this point. I hope that we could minimally reduce the square footage of the dwellings here to 5,000 square feet. We absolutely have to be able to address the parking aspect of this. We all know that. And I do think that's under the purview of this council. And I also think in some way, and I certainly am not a land use planner, so I don't know how, but we have got to address the problems that this will create for the septic system. We all know a 12-bedroom, 12-bath home, and others that exist here, 10 bedrooms, are really not true to the vision that not just to the vision, but to what Lee read us in the 1986 document. I thank you so much for really working together with us today to maintain the special nature of Southern Shores. We are not Kill Devil Hills. We are not Corolla. We are not Duck. We are very special, and we need to hold on to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Pringle Franklin. Good morning.
So I'm Pringle Franklin, and that's a picture of our house back there, which is Pink Perfection. And my great aunt, Edith Pipkin, built it in 1951. Sorry. So I'm the person that created the petition, which I would like to present to the mayor. Now, Mr. Connors, when I printed it out, the names, first and last names of the signees are there. They just want, and here's a little summary that I made. If you could pass that to each council member, please.
Sure. Thank you.
I want to thank the town council for creating the landmark designation program, or at least participating in it. We are on the verge of putting our home in that, and I think that's a great thing. We live in Charleston, and there are two important factors that have been successful for Charleston for preserving the character. One is finding a way to encourage people to keep the old vintage buildings, which you're doing. And the other is to be very thoughtful and restrictive about what you let come into your community. And it takes both. It takes people working together. If you've been to Charleston and you know how lovely it is, back in the 1940s, they were starting to tear down buildings and build gas stations. And some of my ancestors in Charleston, some old great aunts, got active and made a start on saving these buildings. And that's what we see is happening here. I do want to ask you to consider being as restrictive as you can possibly be, both now and for future generations. Consider things like the noise level. You know, if there's anything you can do to restrict outdoor speakers, outdoor lighting, tiki bars, the size of hot tubs. There was a house party near us last summer where there were people on the roof and they had outdoor speakers, and it was just horrific, but it was only for one night. So I ask you to think about 20 years from now. I hope that the future residents of Southern Shores can look back and point to you, gentlemen, as the ones who had the wisdom and the vision to protect what we know and love in our community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jerry Sullivan. Good morning, Jerry.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. My name is Jerry Sullivan. My husband, Michael Zona, and I live at 31 10th Avenue. Michael and I are opposed to the proposal to construct the 12 bedrooms, 17 parking space on the oceanfront. We understand that the homes proposed are within the 6,000 square foot limit, but the intent to pack them tight and potentially use them for event homes not only violates our town vision, but will negatively impact the adjacent properties and the image of our entire community. And this type of building could lead to crowded beaches and drains on our services, including our lifeguard services. I'd already sent to you some suggestions on how we might amend our ordinances to restrict this type of building. Paul Time, when he was a representative and we had the last challenge, said that we could look at restricting the septic drain field size by occupancy. We could consider adopting the ordinance for regulating event homes that was proposed several years ago, but you guys didn't do it at the time because we took the 6,000 square feet. And consider adopting and changing an ordinance to define a structure that can sleep more than a certain number as a commercial property and require that certain regulations be followed to protect the occupants and the neighboring properties, such as sprinkler systems, screening of parking areas, and so forth. This is the second challenge since our state legislature took away our ability to limit occupancy by bedrooms. So we need to continue to be proactive in continuing to look for ways to restrict building of mega homes that do not fit in with our town's vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Andy Ward. Morning, Andy.
Morning, Council, Mr. Mayor. I just want to start off saying that I'm up here speaking as a citizen. I am on the Town Planning Board, and these are my views. They don't come from the Planning Board. Anyway, I just read over the special meeting packet this morning quickly before I came up here. Pretty involved, and I knew most of the contents. I'm just going to kind of spout out a couple of things I gleaned from the first part of the general statute about it limiting building design elements, quote, number and types of rooms, quoted, and that these restrictions may not be applied directly or indirectly. I think that's going to be the buzzword a little bit later on, and we just have to figure out what indirectly and directly means. We had a special meeting January 22nd of 2016. It was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I've heard a lot of people complain about this being at 10 o'clock in the morning, but it looks like a fair amount of people showed up. In that special meeting, the Town Council discussed 3 ZTAs. 1602 was the ZTA that the Planning Board recommended. It did not have a maximum house size in it. It had language restricting to 14 persons the occupancy via septic capacity. 1603 restricted the house size to 6,000 square feet and struck in its entirety the septic capacity. Then there was 1604, which was graduated size limits. Nobody was too whipped out about that one. That night, or that afternoon, 1603 was passed by a 3-2 vote, with Town Council voting to pass 1603, which limited the house size and struck in its entirety the septic capacity. I've written several letters admonishing the town councilman that voted for this, that struck the capacity of the septic. I've written the mayor as well and copied him, all the town council members on that as well. I truly believe that all of us in this room tonight, every single one of us, bears some responsibility for where we are today. I regret not being more persuasive in this process. I could have been louder and more insistent. We as citizens in this town can be better informed on big issues that affect the very fabric of our town. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And Schwartzman? I'm getting closer. Schwartzman, I'll get it. Just give me a couple more years. You're up.
Thank you, Mayor Bennett. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Raska, Ms. Kane. I would reinforce what people have said so far in that I, too, believe that Southern Shores is a unique community, special. It was designed that way by Frank Stick and the Kitty Hawk Land Company that he set up. Comprehensive, controlled, slow growth. And I would also defer to the land use plan as Lee did. She quoted from a 1986 plan. We have the most recent one was adopted in 2012. It is CAMA approved. That is our vision to adhere to. I would note that the CAMA permit, in order to be denied or granted, has to meet certain standards that are under statute, and according to North Carolina General Statute 113A-120, subsection A8, in any case, the development has to be consistent with the local land use plan. This is in statute. So when you say that we didn't have a choice as a town to deny this permit, I question that. Our local permit officer signed off on these permits, agreeing with the Division of Coastal Management that these plans at 98 and 134 Ocean Boulevard are consistent with our land use plan. I dispute that. If they are consistent with our land use plan, then we have no land use plan anymore. We're just giving lip service to it. We're pretending. It doesn't exist. And I would say the same thing about some of the other houses that have been constructed and that have been given CAMA permits and that we have been unaware of. There was a reference to a 10-bedroom house. There's one at 188 Ocean Boulevard now for sale, built just last year. How did that get a CAMA permit? That house doesn't seem to be consistent with the land use plan either. So I think we either hang our hat on the land use plan or we revise it substantially. I favor a septic capacity control. I also favor you looking at square footage controls. I think you should use the total floor area, just like the Division of Coastal Management uses. Why should we have enclosed living space, and yet the state statute speaks to total floor area? That could be changed. I also think we should look again at living space and what that is. Vacation rentals could be accepted. We could deal with them differently. We could also deal with the oceanfront area differently. It's an area of environmental concern. Other areas of Southern Shores are not. So I think you have a lot of options here if you're creative, and I encourage you to explore all of them, and I thank you for this forum.
Thank you, Ann. Yvonne, I can't spell that, I can't read your last name. Is it? I'm sorry, I couldn't make, is it, how do you? Now I got it, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to all of you. I want to say how special and unique Southern Shores is. We're distinct from all the other towns here. One of the reasons are the large size of the lots. The other are that we are a family, people of families who live here and not just rental houses. I hope that we will do all the things that you have brought up, that you will look into all of those to make new rules so that we will not turn into an Nag's Head and turn into an area that has nothing but event houses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bill? Good morning, Bill.
I'm a little hard of hearing, so I didn't hear every word that was spoken by the previous speakers, but I understood the tenor of what was being said. And I just would like you all to realize how those of us who have been coming to Southern Shores for 25 or 30 or even more years, I can't tell you how long we've been coming, how it's been so important to us to live and to rent in a family-free or family-friendly environment. And there has to be a way. I've heard a number of proposals being set forward here this afternoon. There are a number of possible ways in which, whether we can stop a certain amount of building at this point, I don't know, but to set forth a series of proposals which we can protect this community in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Shelley Tarleton. Good morning, Shelley.
Good morning to all of you, both on the council and in the audience. My name's Shelley Tarleton. My property is at 73 Landfall Loop here in Southern Shores. I have several concerns. The first is impact. I think that's what everyone's talking about. Impact on our lifestyle, but very specifically, impact on our services. We have one of our most popular beaches right where these structures are being built. So how many more lifeguards will we need to impact the people that come in those 17 more cars? How will trash be collected? As a person who walks this portion of the beach, I fill trash cans that have been blown open or blown over. Are we going to have a dumpster there? Or are we going to have 29 trash cans that can be blown around and the trash blown out of them? You all have to decide some of those things. How is this going to impact police and fire going north and south on a Saturday afternoon in July when there are 17 cars trying to get in and out of that driveway? How's that going to impact all the rest of us trying to get to church on Sunday morning if you go north to Duck? How is that going to impact the life in our community? Not just this structure, which is the issue at hand, but any structure like this in the future. I would urge you to look at every option that has been presented and every other one you can create, including floating grandma down the river on an iceberg. Whatever you can find, look at it. I have two additional concerns. They're a little bit more personal. I'm concerned about the developer because when the Portsmouth Tide went down, one of our oldest structures, beautifully paneled in juniper paneling, with dishes still in the cupboard and furniture still on the floor, the wrecking ball came in without regard to the historic structure, the historic pieces that others may have used, or even a donation to charity. So I'm concerned about the developer and how their concern for our community is not reflected in their past actions. And finally, I'm concerned that I understand that one of you may benefit financially from this project. If that is true, I would expect that person to act ethically with regard to their profession and recuse themselves from any vote. And if that person does not, I would question your collective ethics if you do not challenge that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the people who signed up to speak. Anyone else like to speak? I can take one or two more speakers. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to support what Anne Schertzmer has stated, that the intent and language of the land use plan be examined with any decisions on the CAMA permit. However, I believe that the land in question is zoned single-family residential. This project is not single-family. It is not intended to be single-family. From the beginning and the way it has been designed, it is set up to be multi-family. And the second thing is, it is not residential. It is designed and set up to be vacation rental accommodation. There is a difference between that and people living in a property in a residential manner. So it is not single family, it is not residential, and the impact on the community and the services of the town will be quite extraordinary. I particularly mention fire protection. I believe the town is considering a new fire department both a large building and a permanent paid fire service. If we have structures such as that contemplated, it will put a major impact on the additional services required for such a building. This building is a commercial building. It should be in a land which is commercially zoned, and it should have a sprinkler system. So on those grounds, I urge the town council and the mayor to reject this on very good legal grounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilith. Yes, ma'am. Please give us your name before you said. Liz
Lanier, L-A-N-I-E-R. Hi, everyone. I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak here, and I think this is a very worthwhile topic. I am a recent resident to Southern Shores. We own our property at 175 Holly Trail. However, we've been visiting the Outer Banks for over 20 years, and I've seen the various different elements of the various neighborhoods in the Outer Banks develop. I'm actually appalled at some of the very large buildings that are in other areas of the Outer Banks. And I want to also mention that my husband and I are real estate appraisers, and we have a unique opportunity to see everything from all the way up to the four-wheel drive in Corova down to Hatteras. I think that there's a very important issue that I haven't heard people mention, and I think they've alluded to, is I think Southern Shores is in a unique opportunity right now to control the way this community is going to proceed into the future. I hear a lot of things from Corova where they're having a lot of problems with very large, really should be commercial sized buildings, 25 bedrooms. I know there's something in contention right now where somebody's is almost finished building and there's a permit and they're having issues with them actually occupying the property. I would hate to see this lovely residential community that I have grown to love turn into what they're encountering, what Kill Devil Hills is, where the oceanfront is crowded with these huge 18 and 24 bedroom properties. I don't think anybody here wants Southern Shores to turn into that. The other thing that I heard someone mention that I think we should be very seriously considerate of is the fact that we do not want to have any allowance of commercial properties of this size and have commercial zoning where everyone mentioned everything is single-family residential. I think we open ourselves up to becoming like Kill Devil Hills and Nags Head if we allow that. I'm very concerned with anything more than what we have right now of going in that direction. And appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I hope that you will consider everything that people have said here and very seriously consider not going in that direction, because I think we're going to regret it down the line.
Thank you. At this time, I'll close public hearing. Public comment. Sure. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Steve Gudis. This will be very quick. Everybody has spoken and spoken very eloquently and articulately about the issue at hand. I'll tell a quick story, and that is thus. I had a mentor, and we all have mentors. We all should have mentors. He was a grand man. He was in charge of the supplies for the Pacific for World War II. He was that big. He was general. He sat with MacArthur. And he talked about the story where the ship with 3,000 people came from Europe with Jewish refugees, and they sat outside Miami for 3 days, and Roosevelt would not allow them to disembark. And my mentor said to me, I remember President Roosevelt. He said, I rode on the running board of his car. I remember the warmth of his voice, the firmness of his handshake. But when it came time to do the right thing, he had feet of clay. Feet of clay. And I asked the town council and others that make these decisions at this time not to have feet of clay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to close public comment for the second time. Thank you. I appreciate your patience this morning. At this point, I'd call on our town attorney to discuss with us, with council, some of our options, some of the things we might want to consider, some of the things he thinks that we probably should not try to consider, but that's going to be his call. Mr. Gallup?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let me tell everyone in the crowd first, I lost my voice on Friday and it's barely back. And in the process of losing my voice and trying to recover from a cough, I slept on my back funny and I've got some sort of back spasms in my upper back, so if I scream and curse just suddenly, it's not at y'all. It's because of my back, and if I say anything dumb, it's because of the amount of Advil that I'm taking. But I'm not sure how I got the dubious distinction in the, I'm going to have to talk with Sheila about sending notices out that have me and them as listed on the agenda. My preference isn't usually to speak about things if I can avoid it. In this case, there are a number of legal hurdles that are run into by a number of different avenues that people have raised. And from my perspective, I can't tell anyone, I can't tell the council, I can't tell any of you what is a legal hurdle that you can and cannot get by. But what I can describe and what I can judge and what I can opine about is whether or not the risk of that hurdle is worth the potential reward, and which hurdles have risks that are substantial enough to try and avoid. Because in reality, if no one ever sues, you can do just about anything you want. But if someone sues and it's something that the town had risk in adopting, then I want the town council to know that they have risk in adopting. So when they pay me to defend it, and I have to take an advocacy position on behalf of the town that they were right, that they're not unhappy that it turns out wrong because I told them ahead of time the chances are this is not going to go well. So that's what my job is. My job isn't to make decisions. My job isn't to decide what the policy is, but it's to advise on what risks are associated with different avenues of doing things. In doing so, and looking at this issue, I looked at a number of items, a number of things that ultimately what I'm going to tell you is what I recommend, and a number of things that I looked at that I do not recommend. I'm going to go through the do not recommend first because it's an easier list. It's a shorter list. Well, it's an actual list. Number one, residential development moratorium. I do not recommend that. Currently, it's statutory. It's not allowed. Moratoria would be what would stop someone who has currently filed for an application and has not gotten a permit yet. We don't have that authority. The General Assembly has taken that away from all the towns in the state currently to adopt residential moratorium. Another option would be to just deny permits without regard to whether or not they should get the permits. Of course, that comes with substantial risk, as one would expect just by the way I've described it. But North Carolina law is pretty clear. If you meet the standards in the ordinance and you meet the standards in the statutes, then you get the permits once you've applied. Restrictions on actual occupancy. That's a restriction on when people can or cannot be in a particular building. So it requires somebody to go and make a determination of when people are in a particular building at any given time to enforce it. Enforcement there is problematic at best. Restrictions on the actual number of cars parked on a lot is very similar. So you could ride by and say you could have a limitation and say that you can't have more than 2 cars in your yard at any given time. Any more than 2 cars, and we think you've got too many people in the house, and therefore we're regulating density, and so there you go. You can't do that. I don't recommend doing that for a number of reasons, not the least of which, again, it's an enforcement problem, but even the case law that supports doing it leaves open a lot of avenues to say that it's probably not a good idea. Limitations on the amount of parking or on stacked parking. One problem that I heard from the audience today is the amount of parking associated with the particular structure that's brought this issue to the forefront. You have to recall, though, that the amount of parking is a response to, across the Outer Banks, including Southern Shores, and across the country. The reason why you go to Banks and you don't see all the parking places filled is because what parking regulations attempt to do is make sure that the number of people that actually might come to a building have parking, so they don't end up parking on the streets, parking in neighbors' yards, parking on septic systems. So the actual parking places themselves, if you take them away, what you ultimately result in is allowing other lot coverage for a larger structure, and in not having the parking for the number of people that might come to a property. Ultimately, that ends up being a consequence that most municipalities have decided is not worth limiting the parking. Limitations on septic system size or capacity. Andy Ward's cousin, David Owens, sent us a letter that said that we could do this for sure. David is probably the most renowned land use expert in the state, and I disagree with him. First, because it's not exactly what he said when I first talked to him about it 3 years ago. And second, because the difference between his job and my job is the difference between a physicist and an engineer. He gets to think about all the theories, he gets to think about all the great ideas, and he gets to wonder about it, but I have to go fight about it. I have to put it on paper, and I have to deal with it. And there are a couple of things that he didn't take into account. One is, in particular, is that state law preempts, or likely preempts, town governments from limiting septic capacity, because it has created a complete and total scheme in the health department for managing septic capacity and septic related issues. And there's a case on point that says that. Unfortunately, the case was at the Court of Appeals, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled it on a different ground, but the best case that we have out there is that case that says towns can't regulate septic. The other problem with septic capacity comes to the indirectly versus directly regulation of bedroom. The reality is that on the Outer Banks, people drove the septic capacity limitations that they had in ordinances at the time that they had bedroom limitations via the same numbers driven by the health department, which says 2 persons per bedroom. So you indirectly get back to bedrooms very quickly unless you have some sort of analysis that shows you that occupancy by some other number of people relates to some sort of sewage flow different from what the health department uses, which is based on bedrooms. And last of which, the biggest problem with septic size limitation is the same as with the parking limitation. The reality of forcing a limitation on septic that will ultimately be lower than the potential number of people that will visit the property creates an environmental issue in that there's not enough septic to deal with the people. So what you're really talking about here is dealing with the people, not with the septic. Dealing with the septic is an end around that doesn't actually work. Limitations on the number and types of bedrooms. We'd love to have that authority. We had that authority for years. That authority solves everybody's problems. The General Assembly took that authority away very clearly. Form-based zoning or restrictions based on how other properties in your neighborhood are used. So form-based zoning is used in some localities as a look at a downtown, a typical historic downtown where you have a bunch of 5-story buildings and they all share walls, but they're on different properties, and someone wants to come in and redevelop. Form-based zoning would keep somebody from throwing a skyscraper in the middle of that, because you'd have to adjust their height and their square footage based on their neighbors. There's a possibility that that could be used here. It's not common. I'm not aware of anywhere in North Carolina that's used. There's no case law on it. I think the biggest problem with form-based zoning, and that would probably be a negative, is that it allows your neighbors to restrict what you do on your property. And that's just a constant, a consistent theme that most people don't agree with, having their neighbors restrict, be able to construct things that restrict their own property. And if you look at it from the perspective of you being the person with the property, and now your neighbors have built something that restricts what you can do, then it becomes a little bit more clear. Treatment of rental homes as commercial under the North Carolina Building Code rather than the North Carolina Residential Code. The requirements for sprinklers and special ingress and egress and firewalls and commercial type stuff are delineated in the North Carolina Building Code versus the North Carolina Residential Code. They aren't zoning. So for you to have that authority, you've got to change the building code or the North Carolina Residential Code. Or you've got to go to the Building Code Council and ask for the authority to adopt stricter regulations. In the case that was mentioned in Currituck, years ago I was somewhat involved in that case, but it's also a case worth watching for a number of other reasons, so I've kept up with it. But the house was a 24-bedroom structure. Well, initially it was 3 structures with, and I think it's 25 bedrooms, because there's a main bridal suite bedroom in the main building, along with the dance hall and the bar and the commercial cooking facility. And then in 2 other buildings that were off of it, kind of in a Y shape, there were 12 bedrooms apiece that were single hallway, kind of like you would expect in a hotel, where each one would have their own lock, their own key, their own bathroom, and everything. And the neighbors challenged those houses as being more than one structure. And the county said, that's fine, you're right, but if you put an air-conditioned hallway between all the structures with open doors so that it's all one building, different wings essentially, then it meets our ordinance. And so the neighbors challenged that with the Board of Adjustment, said it didn't. In the meantime, the neighbors also challenged it with the Building Code Council and the Department of Insurance, and said this is a commercial structure, it has to apply the North Carolina Building Code, not the Residential Code. The initial inspector who looked at it said yes. The full Building Code Council looked at it and said, no, you're wrong. This is a single-family residence under the North Carolina Building Code. And what it gets back to, and the example I always use, is ultimately the Biltmore was a single-family residence. They just had a lot of servants and things. But in North Carolina, the way the building code and historically the way single-family residents have been looked at is whether or not there's an ability for multiple families to actually live separately inside the same structure, like a duplex or an apartment building. So they would have to have all the facilities and living facilities to continue to live, not just to visit in the structure. Treatment of rental homes as commercial under the North Carolina Building Code rather than the North Carolina Residential Code. I consider that. Essentially, it's going to come down to the same thing. The problem is that a rental property being used as a rental property for residential purposes is still not a commercial use under the North Carolina Building Code. Treatment of certain size homes or homes with a certain number of bedrooms under the commercial code. It's going to be the same problem. As you can see, the Latondra house, the Long house in Currituck was, or the Long case, the Latondra is the owner of the house. It was 24 bedrooms. It was, I can't even remember the square footage, but it pales, what we're dealing with easily pales in consideration in the square footage, and they said it was not a commercial structure. Again, despite having a commercial kitchen, a bar, and a dance hall, or a room at least. Treatment of vacation rental use as a separate use under the town zoning ordinance. This is something that arguably is possible, although North Carolina law, the existing current status of the law would probably lie in favor of it not being likely to be upheld. However, there isn't a case in the zoning context clearly answering that question. But the law in North Carolina in zoning has always and historically been, we regulate the use of property, not the ownership, and not who's there. So you could potentially define a vacation rental in your zoning ordinance differently from a home rental, but take the case, for instance, that again brought us here today. There's nothing about that house until it is used that makes it a rental use. Someone, single family, could easily live there just like any other big house. You know, so you've got to get so what would actually be the difference in the ultimate result? What you would end up with is a process where you had zoning restrictions on a rental use that you might not have on a single family resident, you know, a historic or a use someone who's living there. But you're still ultimately going to be limited to what you can limit via zoning. You're not going to be able to do the commercial standards that we talked about. You're not going to be able to do the sprinklers. Those are in the building code. So you've got to then backtrack to zoning and what zoning allows. And I'll get into that in a minute, because that's going to ultimately come to my recommendation part of it. The last thing I considered that's in my list, there's a number of other things I considered, but one was the purchase of the properties by the town and the restriction of property. So then the town could purchase properties and then restrict them via restrictive covenants. I think legal-wise that's possible, but it's certainly a substantial hurdle to get over. As Ms. Lanier can probably tell you, as an appraiser, if you restricted it to keeping the flat top on it, you would lose money in the purchase and sale, which is consistent with how other historic preservation is done, but it's not something to go into with the faint of heart and with the idea that you're going to come anywhere near breaking even. So what my recommendation, well, right before I get to that, let me tell you what zoning clearly can do. So in North Carolina, we're what's called a Dillon's Rule state. If the legislature doesn't grant the authority in zoning, then we don't have the authority. So, and then once you have the authority, you have to exercise that authority in a non-arbitrary and capricious manner. So that's two ends of the spectrum for adopting anything. So first you determine if you have the authority, and then the arbitrary and capricious question means you pick some numbers or some regulation on the outward end based on some correlation to reality. You've got to have some justification for why did you pick 1,000 versus why didn't you pick 995. So that's the arbitrary and capricious end of it on the outside, and then on the input side is whether or not you have enabling authority in the first place. The clear zoning enabling authority in North Carolina allows you to regulate the height, number of stories, and size of buildings or other structures, the percentage of lots that may be occupied, the size of yards, courts, and other open spaces, the density of population, and the location and use of building, structures, and land. And the purposes that you can do this for are to provide adequate light and air, to prevent the overcrowding of land, to avoid undue concentration of population, to lessen congestion in the streets, to secure safety from fire, panic, and dangers, and to facilitate the efficient, adequate provision of transportation, water, sewerage, schools, parks, and other public requirements. And then in 2015, the General Assembly restricted those slightly, at least as they apply to us today, that by adopting another section to the statute, which says that towns cannot regulate directly or indirectly the exterior color, style, materials of roofs and porches a number of architectural type controls. And then someone threw in there the big kink of the number and types of rooms and the interior layout of rooms. And by throwing that in, they completely destroyed the ability to regulate based on bedrooms. And they threw a big kink into the concept of regulating based on septic, because everybody drives septic occupancy based on bedrooms. So from a legal perspective, my recommendation is to stick to the list of things you can do. Stick to the list that says you can do size, height, number of stories, percentage of lots, as in lot coverage is the typical term that most of us have used today. Size of yards, setbacks is what it's talking about there. Density of population, really density of population fits more in a subdivision concept in terms of trying to, just create lot sizes that are certain size, trying to put certain numbers of population within an area. But it may also support an actual occupancy provision. And then the location of use of building structures and land. So the problem that's at issue hasn't ever been really well defined. It's pretty clear it's related to size. It's kind of related to number of people. It's kind of driven by the number of bedrooms. But ultimately, from the outside, the buildings are only driven by size. I mean, if you drive by a building that's 6,000 square feet, you don't know how many bedrooms are in it unless somebody notifies you as part of a CAMA process, and then you go and look at the files and figure out how many bedrooms are in it. So size is something clearly that you can regulate. And size on its own, at some point, will regulate other aspects of the structure. But it also seems that this is driven primarily on the oceanfront, that there are very few complaints about how people have built their houses in other areas of the town. So my recommendation would be to go through the process to have a zoning overlay district for some portion of the oceanfront, either just the oceanfront or all the way to 12, or all the way to 12 and maybe across one line of houses on the west side of 12, and then to use the historical and clear zoning authority in the categories of height, stories, and size, lot coverage, and other things to restrict the development in that area. And I think that will ultimately solve all of your the issues that I've heard if you set the numbers correctly. Now, I'd be more concerned about doing that if you go and change the size rules now. I believe, Mr. Ward, the house that you built was 8,500 square feet, 7,500 square feet. So 4 bedrooms, very large bedrooms. It's on 54 Ocean Boulevard. Yeah, okay, so there are going to be some, even when we went to the 6,000 square foot limitation, there were some houses that were already above that size-wise limitation. And so as you go farther down, there's going to be, you lower the number farther down, there's going to be more and more houses that are above whatever limitation is adopted. And what that does is these houses become legally non-conforming. Everybody calls that grandfathering. Grandfathering's not my favorite term because there's also an illegally non-conforming. But legally non-conforming structures, they can continue to build them, to build in that same footprint and even go up to whatever, if they happen to be smaller than whatever size might be adopted, they could still get larger, or they could adjust within their lot coverage or setbacks, however that's changed, as long as they don't violate the new ones if they're below it. But it does create that situation when you change regulations. Now, for Southern Shores, the benefit that I see there, even in doing an overlay district, particularly in the oceanfront area, is The majority of it is built out to some degree. So there aren't a lot of people who are going to all of a sudden come in with an empty lot that thought they were going to build something bigger, but people will be able to continue to use what they have and use it as they have historically used it, even if the restrictions are substantial. Mr. Mayor, that's pretty much my recommendation.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. Very good presentation to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Counsel?
If I understand all that correctly, then what Shirley and Lily has mentioned keeps jumping out at me. Impacts. So we can use our zoning authority to address impacts, which makes me want to make a motion. But before I make that motion, I want to mention to everybody in the room that it's a rather lengthy motion. So please bear with me. And after I make the motion, if I get a second, when we break into council deliberations, then I will explain the concept behind this motion. So, can I make a motion?
Absolutely. Yes, you can, Jim. Sorry, I wasn't speaking into my mic.
Let me get my granny glasses here. I move the council direct staff to direct a proposed zoning text amendment to the existing town code for council's review at its December meeting, proposing an oceanfront area residential overlay district to encompass all properties east of NC 12 and those properties abutting the west side of NC 12, as well as development standards for this overlay district that will include the following. I'm going to go through 6 of the following. Number 1, setbacks. Side setbacks of 20 feet for structures up to 4,000 square feet. Side setbacks of 25 feet for structures over 4,000 square feet and not greater than 6. Front setback of 25 feet for structures up to 4,000 square feet and a front setback of 50 feet for structures over 4,000 square feet, but no greater than 6. Rear setbacks 25 feet for all structures or as established by camera regulations. Also, an impervious paving setback of 10 feet from the side property line for structures up to 4,000 square feet and a setback of 15 feet from side property lines for structures over 4,000 square feet and not greater than 6. All right, number 2. Remember, I'm going through 6 of these. Number 2, building height, 35 feet for structures up to 4,000 square feet and 28 feet for structures over 4,000 square feet and no greater than 6. Lot coverage, 30% for structures up to 4,000 square feet, 25% for structures over 4,000 square feet, but less than 6. All right, refuse and recycling. A number recommended by town staff of trash receptacles required for all structures up to 4,000 square feet. A number recommended by town staff of trash receptacles required for all structures over 4,000 square feet, no greater than 6. Number 5, landscape buffers. A 10-foot wide single row of plantings for structures up to 4,000 square feet along the side property lines, and a 15-foot wide double staggered row of plantings for structures over 4,000 square feet and no greater than 6,000 along the side property lines. A 10-foot wide single row of plantings for all structures no greater than 6,000 square feet along the front property line. And finally, number 6, parking. All parking spaces to be 10 by 20 feet. All parking spaces to be adjacent to a 2-way, 18-foot wide drive aisle, minimum size drive aisle. No stacked parking allowed. That completes the motion. I'd be glad to explain the concept, but anyway.
Do I have a second to Jim's motion?
I'll second it. That's fine.
Mr. Nason's a second. Any further discussion, council?
I'd like some, I think we should all, I just wanted to speak for a quick second. As all of you know, I'm a local architect here, and I received an email from Guard Skinner during the deliberation process. And in it, he asked a fairly simple question, and I think it's important that everybody hears it, which is, he said, did you or your architecture firm design either of these homes? And so I went ahead and I gave him a call and just let him know that we did not design these structures. And in fact, we had the opportunity to design them, but very honestly didn't feel it was appropriate for the town of Southern Shores. It wasn't a good fit for us. Realistically, probably wasn't a good fit for them either. So on a personal level, I just didn't think it was appropriate to this area. That doesn't mean they can't do it. There's other folks out there who can perform these services for them. But I just wanted to address that because I know, Shelley, you'd mentioned, you were alluding to that in there, and you owed that explanation. And now I'll also say that I have worked for Saga in the past, but I've never worked for them in the town of Southern Shores. I think that just so everybody knows, as an architect, I'm acutely aware of the surroundings, and that our town isn't like all the other towns. In Corolla, you've got it's a whole different ballgame. If you're up on Lighthouse, there's a ton of these houses. The cat's already out of that bag. So, hence the reasons for supporting Jim's, I think, logical recommendation to look at an overlay district to better regulate these. I feel like something is possible, but I'll also go ahead and add a few things. I guess I'd ask Jim a question, if it's all right. A lot in your motion mentions 4,000 square feet. And I know we're just exploring this option with a motion, but how did you come up with that number? Specifically, how do we get there?
What I'm trying to do right now primarily is get a concept out there. A way of looking at this by, I don't know, it's kind of getting outside the box and thinking about it in a different way, though I'm hesitant to start using those kind of monikers, but what it is doing is it's primarily taking a look at the impacts and what the law says we can specifically do. And the concept here is to put the larger a building gets, then the more stringent the growth controls are on it. I mean, 4,000, to get to your question, 4,000, that's kind of an arbitrary number. I mean, if staff came back and said 3,000, or if the town staff said, another number, at this point, I'm not as much concerned about the details in the number as trying to get this concept out there and then get it to the town staff to look at it and come back to us, and then we got to get the planning boards. But
and I asked that intentionally.
The route, if I had to answer your question in a lot less words, it's kind of arbitrary.
Well, and I'm asking that because as an architect, I have a range of experience on this. We get folks like Andy's brother who builds a 7,000 square foot house, but it's got 4 bedrooms. That's all possible and legal, and there's nothing illegal about it. Now, the challenge here is, I think what people are getting upset about is the fact that it's 12 bedrooms. But what I'm concerned about is simply that to get it where people will feel comfortable, which is 7 bedrooms, that's what we've had historically, that number's going to have to be pretty low. And actually, 4,000 probably won't do it. You may be in the 3,000 number. So that, to get to the point, you'd have to be dramatically lower, because the truth of it is, a bunk room could be quite small. And my firm has designed houses that are 5,000 square feet that have 10 bedrooms. Well, I don't think any of us would be happy if we passed a 5,000 square foot limit and the 10-bedroom house came in. I think the same issues are coming up. A lot of the same issues we heard, a few years ago, are back. The main reason that I didn't like what we saw was the 6,000 square foot wasn't going to do anything to solve the problem. We're back here again. And that the square footage thing would have to be so low, and maybe that's what Jim's going for, and I'm willing to explore that, but we have to be prepared for those consequences. Pink Perfection, that's a fairly large flat top. I don't know how many square feet, but I'll bet you're a good 2,500 with the garages, probably maybe 3,000. I don't know the number, but you might be 3,000, 3,500. It's a large lot. I don't think any of us would disagree that it doesn't fit into the neighborhood. It's perfectly contextual. Probably at the time people didn't like the color, but now they love it. And so everything changes over time. So I don't know what that litmus test is. What is that number that doesn't hurt another Pink Perfection, right? Because clearly it's nice to encourage that. Do you have, I'm sorry, do you have a number? Do you know what that is?
I don't know what the number is, but I would like to make the point that Mr. Gallup, I heard him say that the town is able to restrict by use.
Well,
by location and use, okay?
But I hear what you're saying, but I just wanted to.
I'm just throwing that out there, but the square footage
No.
is part of your issue, but that Pink Perfection is clearly used as a family cottage, and perhaps that's a choice that the council.
But to that point, the state has a Vacation Rental Act, which allows folks to rent their homes, and that is in statute, in that is very honestly what pays a lot of our taxes, both across here, not just here, but across Dare County and eastern North Carolina. So I don't think we're going to be overturning the state's Vacation Rental Act anytime soon. I do think that it is worth looking at maybe changes to the language or carve-outs on a state level, so beyond even what Jim's saying. So that's it for my comments.
Hey, Tom, before we deliberate on Jim's motion, because I think there's a lot of discussion there, could I ask the town attorney a question? Because
Certainly.
Okay, because I think a lot of people, the reason they're here, and considering the barrage of emails that we received on the council, most of the people, I think, no doubt, are concerned about going this point forward and restricting the building of big houses. But really, I think the most immediate question they're asking is, what are we going to do to stop the current construction? And can we? There have been several instances of people getting up saying that the land use plan prohibits the construction of large houses, but yet we issued a CAMA permit to allow it. If there's a direct conflict there with our land use plan, is that a basis for stopping further the process of granting a building permit to go forward with building these two large homes that supposedly have CAMA permits already?
You asking me now?
Yeah, I am.
Probably not.
So in other words, a violation of our land use plan is not grounds for denying a permit?
My historical perspective on land use plans is they're the largest document that towns use that don't have any teeth. That they aren't meant to be requirements. They're meant to be kind of fuzzy guidance. And there's nothing in your zoning ordinance that I know of, and certainly nothing in the building code that requires you to be consistent with the land use plan.
So why have a land use plan?
Because the statute requires you to have one.
Sounds kind of useless to me.
I mean, Miss Scherdsma, thank you for saying it before I screwed it up. Scherdsma, because I screw it up every time. I need a couple more years too. I don't know if the rest of y'all have ever seen how it's spelled, but it's not a real easy one to pick up. It's correct that there's a statute out there that CAMA permits have to be that, you have to be consistent with the land use plan, but single family, limited density, CAMA's going to look at that across the state and say, this house is probably consistent with that. And I think that's probably what staff did. I think it's likely to be consistent with, much more likely to be consistent with the CAMA land use plan that the town has than inconsistent. But I understand she or some other folks are challenging that, and maybe they'll get CAMA to change their mind. Maybe they'll get CAMA to change their mind. But I think, given that many other houses have been consistent with the land use plan throughout town and throughout the state that aren't significantly different than this house, I doubt that they'll find an inconsistency.
But you did offer one solution immediately to answer Bill's question, which was that individuals, either private or public, could purchase the properties if they were willing to sell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only likely challenge that would, the only way to guarantee that what no one wants built on this property doesn't get built on this property is that someone who wants to restrict it buys it, either private or public. I mean, that's the
At a certain point, they'll sell it. I don't know what that number is. I can.
Well, he did say $1 million for the lot in the news article, I think.
Oh, did they? Well, so at some point, with.
So he's already set himself out to an offer price, right?
I've kind of thrown out a new concept. Can we get back to talking about that concept? I mean, this is all great.
Well, it's all part of the discussion.
I have Jim, you said North Carolina 12. Okay, where are you talking about specifically? Because, my question would be, did you consider the boulevards, the Ocean Boulevard up, once you make the curve, it's not 12?
Past the triangle?
Yeah.
The flagpole?
Yeah. I mean, how did you?
I think I've
how
got
did you?
this
Where is your district's what I'm asking?
Okay, the way I was trying to word this is if it's east of NC 12, which, would be the left half.
What about adjacent to?
Okay.
Like on the west side of 12?
Everything east of NC 12, which would include Ocean Boulevard after the triangle split. But then also those properties on the west side of NC 12 that abut NC 12. So, yes, it would include everything from NC 12 over to Ocean Boulevard after the triangle.
From the Kitty Hawk
all
line.
of those numbered streets.
From the Kitty Hawk line up to Hickory? Hickory's where Ocean Boulevard.
No, you get on NC 12 right over there.
No, I'm talking about NC 12 up to Ocean Boulevard. Then you proceed north on Ocean Boulevard, you come to Hickory.
Yeah,
He said 12 all the way to Duck.
All the way to Duck.
All the way to Duck.
Okay. And would you agree that, could we refine that over that? I'm okay with what you described. People have a problem with it.
You could probably refine that and get more specific areas.
I'm just trying to get
Well, what I'm envisioning is if you get on NC 12 out there, everything east of that road, all the way up to the Duck line, including Ocean Boulevard and everything, would be in this special overlay district, as well as those properties who abut NC 12 on the west side, which would be just a single road going all the way up to Duck. Drop that off if you wanted, but I mean.
No, that's a lot of those homes back off the road. I mean, especially even on the west side, once you pass the triangle.
Yeah.
That's community more than Ocean.
Well, we may tweak that boundary during the discussion. Staff may come back and tweak that boundary.
But you're getting all the avenues in there too. You're going
way out where it is, yes.
It's comprehensive.
So that's going to need some tweaking, I think. But that's just me.
There's probably a lot about this concept.
So all he's doing is asking that this go
a lot of tweaking.
Bring a presentation.
Yeah,
we have a motion on the floor.
Well, wait a minute.
It's been seconded.
Well, I want to ask him about, this motion is just to send this back to staff to develop a proposal, right?
Actually, this would take it back to staff to work up on a zoning text amendment for whatever, an ordinance.
ZTA.
And then bring it back to us to look at, and then we can send it to the planning board. Let's give this a first stab and bring it back to us.
I'm just asking, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not to put it in effect or try.
Yeah, we're not voting on it to go into effect today, but we'll have a chance to look at it again.
Exactly. Probably more than once. Jim, Councilman Connors has put a lot of work into this. As you can imagine, he's put a lot of hours into it, and I think it's something we should consider strongly. I want to add something to his what he's proposed to us, and I'm not going to take away from that. I'll give you guys a choice. We're going to go ahead and vote on this, and then hear what I want to say. It gets the public more involved, or you want to just?
I have a question for Ben on this motion first.
Go ahead.
All right. On creating zoning overlay districts, are there any restrictions at the state level or any rules in effect that we don't know? I mean, Jim did work. I'm just asking, do you have any understanding of, my understanding in looking at those is if you're going to create a district, you need to have a reason for creating that district.
It's the same backside arbitrary and capricious analysis. I mean, you can't just create the district for no reason. You've got to be able to show that there's a difference between the oceanfront area and the not oceanfront area. And I think in this case, we should be able to spell that out to some degree without a whole lot of challenge. The biggest challenge for map rezoning, which is what an overlay district is twofold. One, the notice requirements are a royal pain. And then twofold is that we're not dealing with here is where you have spot zoning, where you're trying to, where you got one property in the middle of nowhere that wants some particular zoning and somebody goes and changes it. And then as that expands, spot zoning can be allowed and can't be allowed. But when you're talking about a large area like the oceanfront that we're talking about, the larger the area, the easier it is to avoid that question.
Ben, can I follow up that? Sure. Because you talked about the reason for a district. One thing that stuck out to me in the highlighted section of the language was that it allows for regulation in what's called a local historic district. Now, we've already done some work up front. Well, no, we can set up a local historic district. So this overlay could be, because we've already set up a commission for these historic homes. We've got a precedent. We did that a while ago. So if we can go ahead and use that portion within the law that allows us to say this is a historic district, that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily regulate style or form, but that isn't, it's a carve-out that's in here. I'm just trying to find anything.
You don't currently have a historic district, and you would have to go through the steps and the essentially, if you're considering and interested in Mr. Connor's concept, it's going to be about the same amount of process. And you're going to, if you create the historic district over that whole area, one, you're going to have the concept that some of it's not historic, and then two, you're going to run into the trouble that the initial historic district program ran into, where there were some people who said, but I don't want you to force me to be in it. I want to make sure that you are doing this only by voluntary. Just to bring that up from the past. But you're right that is an exception to the application of the limitations on the regulations that the town can have that was created by that statute. But
I'm sure Charleston went into that too, though, at the time.
But they
went into a historic district, essentially.
Yeah.
They're in South Carolina.
Yeah.
I appreciate you folks hanging in here. We're going to get this decision on this very quickly, or I think fairly quickly, and I still have something I want to present to you before you leave, so just stick around a few minutes. We have a motion on the floor by Mr. Connors for us to consider an overlay district. We've had a discussion about it. Any further discussion? I call for the vote. All in favor of Mr. Connors' proposal, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Well, let me ask a question. Are we sending it to the
Yes.
staff, or we're
Yes.
voting on?
We're not going to accept it. We're just going to send it to the staff.
Okay, it wasn't clear.
Yeah,
I
and you
thought that
can't,
was clear.
and it's just like any other zoning amendment. I mean, it would have to go through the planning board and
That's what I
and
figured.
come
I
back
wanted
through
to
the
make sure.
process, yeah. So this is, my understanding is that what this is not even starting the process with the planning board. This is, let's put something on
Go back
paper,
to
bring it back to
council.
you, and then you're going to look at
I'm with you.
it, change it, and send it to the planning board.
So that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Once again, anyone opposed? Anybody, do you oppose this, or you? Thank you. Got it. So everybody's in favor of this, is that what you guys feel? All right, thank you.
Can you send it?
I'm gonna present a little different option for us to consider, if I may. I'll need your help on it. This is going to take everybody in this town pulling in the same direction, and probably our local elected officials, and probably the League of Municipalities getting involved with us as far as a lobbying effort. It's going to be a real uphill battle, but in conversations with various people at different levels of the state, I have strong reason to believe it's workable. The root cause of our problem, which we've all talked about now and talked around for the last 2 hours, is North Carolina General Statute 160A-381 with changes for Session Law 2015-86. Took away our authority to regulate occupancy through our bedrooms, bathrooms, septic. And that forced the issue. Before that, we had been able to control occupancy, density, whatever you want to call it, simply by saying you can build this size house on your lot as long as you comply with all these things, and you can't have more than 7 bedrooms. Not complicated. And it kind of helped keep house sizes reasonable, and it also kept our numbers on the beach down, which people were concerned about. We must attempt to change, amend, or otherwise reduce the impact of this statute on our community. And in a larger sense, other municipalities in Dare County like Duck and Kill Devil Hills and Nags Head. I've met with the mayors, all of them, at one time, discussed this with them. Every one of them said, we'll help you any way we can. We'll get re-involved. As you may know, Nags Head was very involved 3 years ago with letters to Paul Tyne, letters to Bill Cook, asking for their support in trying to soften the tenor of this particular legislation. It didn't work. We don't know why, except the legislature was strongly influenced by the builder lobby at the state level. And I think, I say this candidly, but I think there's some let's say that the statute has not been quite as well received as everybody thought it would be all across the state. There are some areas that really probably needed this, because some of the towns were overreaching their authority. But in fact, we weren't. We were kind of going along our merry way and doing what we thought was working for us. I've discussed this with the mayors. Duck and Nags Head in particular have shown strong interest in being involved. In a lengthy conversation with my contact person at the League of Municipalities, office in Raleigh, I was advised that we could get our local elected officials on board, House and Senate, to support this, and our local builders associations will lend their support. Not necessarily all of them, but enough of them to make a difference. The league would be willing to lobby on our behalf. I've had more recent conversations with 2 members of the Outer Banks Home Builders, both who have voiced their support for this effort. I plan to move forward with this, recognizing that yesterday's election results could have a bearing on our success. But I think it's worth a shot. I think it's worth devoting some energy to it. I don't want to bring up yesterday's news, but we were told we probably couldn't do a beach nourishment project. Remember? It wasn't going to work. We were told we couldn't stop the drainage problems on Dogwood Trail. It wasn't going to work. Well, they did work. But it took people getting behind it and pushing it and getting some support at the state level. I think we can do the same thing here. I'm very confident we can. I think one of the key things in our favor is that we have a unique geographic situation here. We don't have the mountains and thousands of acres to be developed yet. We're stuck with what we have, which is wonderful, which is a very finite amount of land to work with. We have to do all we can to protect that. And I think the rules we had in place since 2000 or 2001 had done the job for us very effectively. But like I say, I'll need your help and your support. I think this is something we can do simultaneously with what Mr. Connors has recommended. We can move forward with that proposal and that motion and have the staff working on this while I'm going with your help and other people's help going in another direction that might negate the need for this overlay zoning. I'm not going to ask council to give me for a motion or anything. I'm just going to say I'm going to try to keep moving forward with this and feel I can make it. I won't guarantee I can make it work. I can guarantee I'll work hard to make it work. Council, does anybody have anything else they want to add?
Good luck.
Thank you, thank you.
Talking with them.
I'm going to need that. Any further business, council? Fred?
I just want to say, I think it's been a good meeting, and I appreciate Ben's presentation. I wish we'd had this special meeting about 3 weeks ago when this issue first came up. I know I really pushed for it. It would have provided information to the public that they were desperately seeking, and I think today really really helped us better understand what we can do and what we can't do. And I do support what you're trying to do, Tom, going to the state legislature, and hopefully some changes will come about
Well,
soon.
that's the thing I feel is the root cause of the problem. Let's address the cause of the problem, and if we aren't successful there, then come back to these other backup plans we can have. Thank you, Fred. Anything else, council? Gary?
Tom, I'd like to send something to the planning board. And not to counter what you've done, Jim, but to give us another option. And that would be, ask them to relook at our ZTA about the 6,000 square foot. And where it says living space, to maybe put total enclosed area. Also, to look at adding septic capacity and how they could do that at a graduated or whatever. And also look at parking and see if they could add something into that immediately to bring back to us we might could put in place. We may not be able to stop what's going on right now, but it would maybe be, I think yours is going to take a long time, Jim, because of the way it's going through. It may not, but I'd like to do that and give the planning board a chance to bring something back to us.
I think the planning board definitely needs to be involved. I just,
I understand.
no, please hear me out. Remember, they've still got something else hanging on their plate from the last time we passed something and sent it back to them. That's got loose ends hanging that. They need to look at that. Now, I would encourage the planning board starting to look at this issue, but rather than them starting to look at tweaking something right now, let's let this town staff process run its course and get back to us on December. Now, the town staff, to maybe address your concerns, maybe they could be involved in the plan, get the town staff and planning board to, some input from the planning board in the development of this, what we passed today, man, I'm starting to speak in circles here. Get the planning board's input as the town planning staff works on the zoning text amendment that they will then bring to us at our December council meeting. Would that work?
I'm fine with that. I'm motioning that we send to the planning board what I just said about total enclosed area, septic capacity, and parking.
Well, if we could amend your motion to say include the planning board in staff's deliberations, I think that'd be good. But to send this as to the planning board as a separate matter, okay.
I think we don't want to work in at cross purposes. I think we need to keep them on working in the same direction.
I think this is an option that could limit what's going on right now that you have a lot of folks upset about.
As I recall what the town attorney said, though, including the septic capacity is kind of chasing
I understand.
Chasing a ghost. I don't know.
Okay. I'm just making the motion.
Okay.
Do I have a second to Gary's motion?
I'll second it.
Any further discussion?
Yeah, I see Gary's point. He's trying to do a kind of a quick fix while Jim's much more comprehensive approach is being staffed and then eventually being considered by the planning board. If the planning board could do something quickly, hopefully that would stop any further development. I think that's your intent, right, Gary?
Well, yeah, because I heard what Ben said with property notification and all that. We're looking at with his proposal, probably 6 months out.
I don't think so. It's probably 90 days. I mean,
90 days?
I think.
From when it comes back in December?
I think at most is that you're looking at a 30-day shift by doing what you're asking.
Okay, well,
I mean,
but there's
I
a
think
process
that's
of
what
it
is.
coming back to us, then property notification would be how many days?
You gotta give them like 25 days, but you can do that. It's a notification of the public hearing that you're gonna have to have anyway. I don't think it's a substantial change in the time frames.
So we've got a motion and a second.
Yes.
I'll just say, I'm not against your idea of how to measure, to kind of to change the standards to measuring. I think that could potentially be incorporated into gyms, but if we're only seeing a 30-day difference, potentially, max, I'm not comfortable just disregarding Ben's presentation about septic, just to get 30 days.
I just said for them to look at it and bring us some recommendations, then we have to vote on it.
And what I'm suggesting is have them look at it, but as part of the town staff's efforts, rather than having them look at it separately. I mean, because that joint effort is going to be focusing on the legal aspects, what we can do and what we can't do.
Let me take just a minute and ask the chairman of the planning board his thoughts on this. Go ahead. I'll wait to speak on this if you would.
Okay, my name's Glenn Weeder. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chairman of our planning board. And just a couple thoughts. When I hear quick fix, it makes me a little nervous because I don't really do things quickly. I like to do the research, do the homework, and every member of our planning board thinks the same way and does the same thing. So I think what Mr. Connors has done is comprehensive, and I think it's viable, and I think he took every point that Mr. Gallup put as what we could conceivably restrict, and he put it into his ETA, a rather lengthy one that we're going to be tremendously, burdened by, I think, in terms of looking at it. However, I think it should be whatever we're talking about should be incorporated into one. I don't think we want to do it twice. And I don't think there is a quick fix for this, okay? The quick fix was 2 years ago. And that's gone, the water's under the bridge. The time is now. The time is now, and we need to do it the right way. The other thing is, I think that Mr. Owens wrote a letter to you, Mayor Bennett, and I would ask if you would just read that letter, because I think there's some viable information in there, and there may be some leeway in some aspect of it. If you choose not to read it, that's fine. And Mr. Gallup, no disrespect to you, I know what your feelings are on this. We've talked about it, but I think that Mr. Owens is one of the foremost authorities on this topic.
He is the foremost.
Thank you.
I'll give you that.
He's also my neighbor, so I really would love to hear, or let the public hear that letter, because I think it's important. And again, kudos to Jim. You did a really tremendous job, comprehensive job on that, and I think that we can really get this done together.
The state really didn't leave us much other.
They sure didn't.
Or many other options.
They sure didn't. And Mayor Bennett's concept of going after the lobbying aspect of it, I think, is phenomenal. And that's something that we can all do together. Every one of us can speak to the people in our state government and say to them what needs to be said in order for this to be changed, in order for this to be fixed. But in the meantime, I think we have Mr. Connors got a beautiful proposal, and we should get to work on it as soon as we can and incorporate what Gary put forth into what Jim put forth and come up with something, and I think we can do it in a timely manner.
I think I'd like to mention that the advantage that I've had is partly the profession that I work in, just like as Councilman Nason's. But what I'm doing here is just getting a concept, that approach out there that based after reviewing all of Ben's opinions and everything, that I think hits the nail on the head as to what kind of approach we can take. It's now the devil's in the details, and that's where we need the planning board and the builders, you know, input to like, okay, we've got our goal. Our goal is to address the impacts, which by default will help, if we do it right, put the squeeze on these structures to address the size, the occupancy, and the other aspects. The devil's in the details. Now it's up to our planning board, the community, and everything to work this out.
Thank you, Jim. Gentlemen, you're stressing my patience levels and my memory. We have a motion on the floor by Mr. McDonald, which was seconded by Mr. Newberry. Do you wish to withdraw that motion, or you want to leave it and have us vote on it?
No, I like to send it.
All right.
Let those guys, I trust their judgment.
All in favor of Mr. McDonald's motion to have this planning board working on this simultaneously with the town staff, indicate by saying aye. All opposed, same sign.
Nay.
Nay. So the motion was made but not carried. Thank you, Gary. I will make one last comment before we ask for adjournment here from the council members. About 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I took it upon myself, in the interest of full disclosure, to go meet with Amit and Sumit Gupta, the owners of Saga. And we met for over an hour. And I asked them some very direct questions. First I told them about the feelings and the feedback I was getting from the residents of our town. I made it very clear to them this was not something we were in favor of, and they could expect a lot of negative feedback from our citizens because we weren't happy with it. I asked them if they would consider selling the property. Didn't give them a price, didn't offer to do it by the town. They said, would you consider selling the property? And the answer was an emphatic no. And they talked about it for a few minutes first and came back and said, absolutely not. Our investors would not sell the property. They didn't say not for any price. They said they wouldn't sell it. I asked them if they would consider reducing the number of bathrooms and bedrooms to something close to what traditionally we'd had here in our town. 7, maybe even 9, but not 12. And I got the same answer. They weren't curt about it or nasty. They just said, no, we wouldn't do that. So I didn't push it any further than that. It had been a very pleasant meeting up to that point. I didn't want to walk out of there with, tell them what I really thought. Anyhow, that's the way it worked out, and I felt good about doing it. I felt like I made an initial effort. Hopefully, if we're going to stop it at that point, we could maybe it might have helped, but it didn't, and we're now 3 weeks further along. Anybody else have anything they want to say at this time?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Peter.
I hate to bring this up, but I mean, did you intend to take up Mr. Weeder's recommendation of reading the letter?
I'm sorry, Peter. Thank you. Yes, twice you've had to help me. I appreciate it. Thank God you're here. Yeah, you want to bring that up, Andy?
You can't. I'll be glad. There are no worries. Oh. I don't. Attorneys disagree.
I've already cleared it with Ben.
Do we have a signed version of this?
Yes, we do.
We do have a signed?
This was a draft. I have in our file. We have a signed version on letterhead from the NC.
If you'd like me to read it, I've got the actual signed version.
It's on state letterhead. Is that correct?
Yeah.
North Carolina School of Government. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be glad to read it, Mr. Mayor.
All right.
October 30, 2018, addressed to Mayor Tom Bennett. Mayor Bennett, I followed with great interest discussions about regulation of very large residences and resort areas on the Outer Banks. As a longtime land use lawyer and now part-time resident of Southern Shores, I appreciate the attention you and the council have undertaken to retain the town's low-density family character. As we briefly discussed yesterday, the town has several options it may consider as it evaluates its ordinance provisions on this issue. 2015 legislative amendments to GS 168-381 that prohibit a town from using its zoning to regulate the number and types of rooms in 1- and 2-family residential structures complicates your efforts in this regard. That said, GS 168-381A expressly allows the town to regulate both the size of buildings and the density of population. This allows the town to set a maximum square footage of buildings, as the current code does. It also allows the town to regulate the density of population by setting maximum septic and parking capacity for residential lots. A good illustration of this authority is provided by a recent court case upholding a Chapel Hill zoning restriction that limited the number of cars that could be parked at residences in a particular zoning district. Pat Moore v. Town of Chapel Hill, 233 NC App 133, review denied by the Supreme Court, 367 NC 519, year 2014. The limit was 4 cars per residence and was applied to both owner-occupied and rental properties. The regulation was based on concerns that over-occupancy of housing in this zoning district had led to traffic, congestion, excessive garbage, noise, and displacement of longtime residents by transient renters. The town contended and the court agreed that the number of cars allowed at a residence was reasonably related to occupancy and population density. The court thus held that parking limits were a permissible zoning restriction. A limit on septic capacity is similarly related to addressing the land use impacts of population density such as traffic, noise, congestion, and preservation of the low-density, non-commercial character of residential zoning districts. If the town elects to include such a restriction in your ordinance, it should be based on regulating maximum occupancy by limiting the total septic capacity allowed per lot, setting a maximum daily flow rate, or using a similar measure based on occupancy and density, not the number of bedrooms in the structure. It should be the maximum number of occupants of a residence that is regulated, not how many rooms are used to house those occupants. The land use and zoning concern is, for example, having 24 occupants in a single-family home, whether they are all in a single bunk room or are in 12 bedrooms. And John Boy, good night. John Boy, good night. That just kind of brings that to mind. Should the town elect, that wasn't in the letter, I apologize. Should the town elect to consider revision of its ordinances on this, I would be glad to assist your staff, attorney, or board in any way you feel would be productive. Yours, David Owens, David W. Owens, Gladys Hall Coates, Professor of Public Law and Government. And if I could briefly just address it,
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor.
You can.
As I've said, if I have a question, David Owens is the guy I call. If I want to start by looking something up, I pull out David Owens' book to start. One of the pages I looked at was the page on preemption, which he doesn't discuss in his letter, but it's clearly a problem. Also, I looked up the Patmore case that he references in his letter, which doesn't touch on septic at all. It only relates to parking. And despite the fact that he says that the town contended and the court agreed that the number of cars allowed at a residence was reasonably related to occupancy and population density, first of all, it was a 2014 case before the 2015 legislation came out. But even more importantly, that's not what the court said. The court, in footnotes and other notes, did 2 things. And here are my notes. 2 important points come out of the Patmore case. First, the Court of Appeals recognized that the context establishes that the amendment was intended, and this is a quote, the context establishes that the amendment was intended to regulate the ratio of bedrooms to tenants in rental properties in the NNC district by restricting the number of vehicles parked in the yard. We're right back at bedrooms, directly or indirectly. As with other areas of regulation, this has the potential to be at least an indirect regulation of the number and types of rooms contrary to NCGS 168-381H. Second, the plaintiffs in this case, and the court was explicit about this, they even had a footnote and pointed this out. The plaintiffs in this case did not challenge whether using parked cars to determine occupancy was accurate. So they agreed that it was accurate. But what the court's saying is if somebody wants to challenge that, we might have a problem with it. And the court expressed no opinion, quote, concerning whether it would be a valid defense to a citation that the number of cars on a property did not indicate the number of tenants, but instead were cars belonging to temporary visitors. So again, the plaintiff didn't fight about that. But what the court's saying is those are two areas that we're not sure we agree with the plaintiff, but if they're going to not fight about it, we're going to let them not fight about it. But if the next guy comes around and fights about it, the town might have a problem. And the same thing is going to happen with septic. And that's part of why when we went through parking, and I said, you could have a 2 parking limit, you could have a 4 parking limit, you could have an 8 parking limit. Patmore's the case that gives you that authority. But it also kicks you in the knee when a first-year law student reads through it and says, well, the plaintiff in that case didn't fight about this, I'm going to fight about this. So, again, David Owens is my guru. He is the #1 man in the state, and there's nobody more capable than David. But to the extent he's saying there is no risk in having a septic regulation as your limitation on the structural aspect of it, I don't agree with him. Could he be right? Could nobody ever ultimately litigate it? Or somebody litigate it and, I've won cases that I should have lost. I've lost cases that I should have won. That's how lawyers work. But I have to say that there is substantial risk associated with it, despite David Owens' comments.
Before we take comments from the audience, I'd like to mention something.
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm sorry, let me regain my train of thought here. I'm sorry, this is what happens when we get interruptions from the audience. I was waiting patiently for him to finish, and now I've lost my train of thought, so... Oh, okay, I got it now. Regarding regulating for septic, I'm always hesitant about tying something that the town is trying to do to another regulatory's enforcement of something in town. I mean, to put that in plainer English, we're putting our eggs in the magnanimity of another party over something that we cannot control. It's a state through the county issued permit, and we're trying to tie a growth control to something that we don't have control in, and it's going to be extremely difficult to enforce. So anyway, sorry.
Thank you, Jim.
May I?
You want to make a motion to adjourn?
No, I'm going to do that, but I want to add, everything can be challenged, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. And the thing on septic, Jim,
yes.
Since you brought that back up, my issue is these are oceanfront houses. It's an environmental concern. When you have that capacity of septic that close to our ocean, that's a concern for me, and it's an environmental concern, and it should be for all of us. And that's one of the reasons I bring it back up and think, okay, if we have the foremost attorney, as you said, guru, whatever, stating that everything can be challenged. Jim's motion and what we bring back and what we pass can be challenged. So I'm just saying it can be tied to, for us, at an oceanfront area, an environmental concern, because it is a septic capacity and an overflow. There's also, that is a flood zone, and we have overwash from time to time, not as much as some of our towns below us, around us, like Duck and Kitty Hawk. But, anytime you're in that flood zone, that becomes a huge environmental concern, not only on our ocean side, but on our sound side.
So where are we going with this discussion about limiting by septic? Is there a motion?
We already made one that was defeated, so.
A motion to adjourn. How about that?
All right, I've got a motion to
like that
adjourn.
one.
Council, a motion, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting's adjourned, guys.